Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Reed. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Mondo Weiss. We hope you're all staying safe and healthy, and we appreciate you joining us today for this program. We're excited to partner with In These Times Magazine and Verso Books to bring you today's program looking at Joe Biden's politics on Palestine and what his campaign means for the Democratic Party. We'll be answering some of your questions from the audience later in the program. If you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope, just post a question in the comments. I'm going to turn things over now to Michael Arria, our U.S. correspondent. Michael?
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate all that. I wanted to welcome everybody to this event where we're going to be talking about Joe Biden's record on Palestine and what his campaign and potential presidency could mean for the Democratic Party's wider foreign policy agenda. And we're excited to welcome two journalists who have covered these issues extensively, Sarah Lazare and Branko Marcetic. Sarah's a web editor in These Times, where she covers foreign policy, labor, number of other issues. Branko's a staff writer at Jacobin, and he's also the author of Yesterday's Man, which is a political biography of Biden that was recently published by Verso. We'll link to Verso's site where people can purchase the book they want when this gets posted. But I wanted to thank you both for chatting with me today. I'm looking forward to it. And we had a lot of people register, so I think a lot of people are looking forward to your analysis. A quick thing before we begin, I just wanted to mention that this is the fourth live stream that we've done at Mondo Wise, I think, and the previous ones have all been focused on what's currently happening in Palestine. This is the first one I've moderated and the first one specifically about US politics, but I believe all the other ones have been moderated by my colleague Yumna Patel, who's a bank-based correspondent, and I'd encourage people to go on our website and check those out if you haven't seen them, and to also pay attention to our social media because we're planning a lot more of these so people can get updates about future live streams there. But having said all that, I'll jump right into it. I wanted to start before we got to Biden specifically. It seems like a decade ago based on what's happened in the world since, but it actually wasn't that long ago that there were a bunch of Democratic candidates who weren't Joe Biden running for president. And Sarah, you wrote multiple pieces during the campaign about the foreign position of the major candidates. Can you share your impressions of how foreign policy was covered by the media during the campaign? And also, I'm just wondering, as someone who's covered this for a long time, if anything stood out about foreign policy in the context of the Democratic candidates?
Sure. So my biggest impression of the media was that it did a pretty atrocious job of covering issues of war and militarism at all, even though that's the area where presidents have the greatest power to act without Congress. It still got very little attention. And when major media outlets did cover militarism, it often assumed the benevolence and necessity of US wars and occupations and cast left programs as beyond the pale, unfortunately. So on March 2nd, I did an analysis where I looked at all 10 presidential debates for the Democratic ticket up until that point, all 10 of them. And I found that moderators had asked a total of 21 questions about how candidates plan to pay for their political agendas. So in every single case, moderators demanded to know who will bear the cost of social goods like Medicare for all, climate change mitigation, free college, things like that. And there wasn't a single instance where a debate moderator asked the candidate how she or he plans to pay for US wars, meddling, or our endless occupations. So I think that says a lot about the frame that the media used to cover the 2020 bid for the Democratic nomination. So as far as what stood out to me about the Democratic field, first of all, unfortunately, Biden was on the right of that field. We all know that he helped lead the march to the Iraq War, despite his efforts to repeatedly deny that on the campaign trail. He is also defined by his career-long support for Israel, but also a host of things that he did under the Obama-Biden administration. So in October 2011, Biden publicly praised the NATO bombing of Libya, although in 2016, he later claimed that he had been against it. And, you know, he served in an administration that backed the 2009 coup in Honduras, expanded drone wars, and launched US participation in the horrific war on Yemen, which is now more than 5 years old. and it's still ongoing. And Biden came out against the Yemen war that the Obama and Biden administration helped inaugurate U.S. participation in, but he did so pretty late in the game at a time that there was already mainstream Democratic opposition to that war. One other thing that really sticks out to me is that many candidates, and this is a big problem, got a free pass, and their records on war and militarism were never deeply interrogated. I would put Buttigieg, Warren, and Harris in this category. I don't want to put everyone in the same camp. For example, Warren is slightly to the left of Biden, but it would be a huge mistake to say that she was progressive or had a standout record on militarism. She said on February 21st that she supports sanctions on Venezuela, reversing an earlier claim that she opposed them. Unlike Sanders, she's repeatedly engaged in fear-mongering over the Korean peace process. And unlike Sanders, she voted in favor of a 2017 bill that bundled together sanctions against Iran, Russia, and North Korea, and very much laid the groundwork for Trump's maximum pressure campaign that we're seeing play out in a horrific way today amid horrible sanctions on Iran while Iran is being hit by the COVID-19 crisis. And then there's just one more thing I want to say, which is, so Sanders is not perfect. I want to be clear about that. For example, he voted for the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which was used to justify the US invasion of Afghanistan and a host of other acts of aggression since. But he was far and away the strongest on war and militarism. And for that, he earned the scorn of many who feared that they would lose influence over his administration. Among them, the Center for American Progress, pro-Israel mega donor Haim Saban, just to name a few. And there were a few things that really set him apart from the pack. He was the only person who caucuses with the Democrats to vote against the 2017 bill bundling together sanctions against Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And he really led on trying to end the Yemen war. And just one other thing is he surrounded himself with better people. You really have to look at who is surrounding a candidate. His people, while not perfect, came from the left of the foreign policy debate in Washington when it comes to foreign policy, and some of them came from movements.
You mentioned Biden's support for the Iraq war. Branko, it was framed in some quarter of the campaign that Biden has this bad vote for the Iraq war. There's other people who are running for president who also have bad votes. But you document in your book how Biden did a lot more than just vote for the war. Can you talk about or describe his role in the U.S. towards war with Iraq? And connected to that, I wanted to revisit this narrative that he tried to push during the campaign, that he voted for the war but then immediately opposed it. If you can make any sense, if it's in any way accurate at all.
Yeah, sure. Biden, his relationship with Iraq started obviously with the first Gulf War. At the time, Biden had come off a decade of basically telling Democrats, based on Reagan's wins, it's time for us to become more like Reagan. It's time for us to stop cringing at the use of force and to be more willing to go into military interventions and all that kind of thing. And he supported several of Reagan and Bush's adventures overseas. When it came to the Gulf War, he said, this is a bad war. He kind of fought a lonely fight against it, lost, and then once it was a political success for Bush, he turned around and he said, well, I made a mistake. And from there on, he sort of became a very heavy Iraq hawk through the 90s. And of course, that culminated in 2002 when he spent that entire year, and I argue in the book, it's because he had one eye on his re-election campaign that year. He spent that entire year pushing for the Iraq war. As you say, people say that it was one bad vote, and Hillary Clinton also voted for it, and a host of other people you can point to in the Democratic Party voted for it. And those are bad, by the way. Those are all bad votes. But even beyond that, it wasn't just a vote. Biden was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time. He had a fair amount of power. In fact, there is a local newspaper at the time that says, Biden here is at a crossroads. He can either play ball with Bush and, basically give him everything he wants, or he can use his position to kind of stymie his efforts and to make life difficult for him. And I think owing to the fact that he knew he was going to have to fight for re-election in 2002, he decided to go for the latter option and just sort of be a doormat for Bush. And so he spent that year really, pushing this idea that Saddam had to be gotten rid of, that he was dangerous, that he was maybe in cahoots with Al-Qaeda. He called this Senate Foreign Relations hearing on whether there were WODs in Iraq and whether Saddam was connected to terrorists. He basically called a vast majority of pro-war voices who were saying, yes, indeed, Saddam does have these weapons. He does have to be gotten rid of. In fact, Biden even opened the hearings by basically saying as much. And he actually published an op-ed at the time saying, we can't appease Saddam. We have to get rid of him at some point, whether now or later. And then after that, after he had arranged this testimony that was very firmly in the pro-war stance, left out skeptics like Scott Ritter and a bunch of other people who, had been involved in weapons inspections and everything at the time. He then went on the news shows and he said, well, look at all these experts that say we have to go in there and that he's dangerous. So, he used his own kind of unbalanced lineup of testimony to basically argue, to then point to and say, well, the experts say this has to be done. Of course, he voted for the Iraq War. He now says, as you mentioned, that he may have voted for it, but then he immediately did everything to try and stop it. Completely untrue. Biden voted for it. Then, 2 months later, he went on a world tour. And the Republican Party, the Delaware Republican Party, actually sent him sort of a bon voyage message. They said, well, we wish Senator Biden well on his trip, and we hope that he will continue to support President Bush's policies. And what Biden did on this trip was he basically went around he went to Israel, Qatar, Jordan. I believe he also went to Germany and met some, Iraqi kind of opposition forces. And he was basically paving the way for the U.S. and its coalition partners to go into the country, to invade the country without any sort of too much hubbub in the region. And he even went to the Kurdish part of Iraq and he spoke to the Kurdish parliament and he basically suggested to them that, if they rebelled against Iraq, the US would have their back. And, that doesn't where it ends. I mean, at the point where a bunch of Democrats were starting to change their mind about the war because they were seeing what a disaster it already was, they were seeing that it was not going to be this quick, easy invasion, Biden continued to support the war. He said, he was asked on Fox News, should the position of the Democratic Party be the position of Howard Dean, who was obviously running as a sort of the anti-war insurgent, or positioning himself to run as that? And he said flatly no. He criticized the people in his party who called for multilateralism and that kind of thing. He sort of suggested that they were being silly or foolish. And even as late as August 2003, he was calling for something like 60,000 more troops to go into Iraq. By 2004, and after Kerry lost to Bush, and once the politics of the war really started to change pretty firmly, not just in the Democratic camp, but everywhere else, then Biden came around. But this idea that he was opposed to it after voting for it is completely untrue. And at this point, the fact that he keeps saying it, and it's been debunked several times by CNN, Washington Post, a whole bunch of other outlets, he must know that he is telling a lie.
Sarah, it seemed to me that Palestine came up more on the campaign trail this year than it has maybe at any point in my lifetime, at least. They're mainly because of pro-Palestinian activists, young people with groups like If Not Now and JBP Action, who showed up and asked the candidates about the occupation and military aid. Bernie obviously mentioned conditioning aid on the campaign trail. What were your big takeaways about how that issue was discussed by the candidates? And did anything stand out for you?
Sure. Well, I think that the biggest thing that stood out to me is that we saw really clearly that there is a shift in the base of the Democratic Party towards greater sympathy with Palestinians. Polling shows this very clearly. And we're also seeing ever larger and more effective movements against Israeli occupation and apartheid and in solidarity with Palestinians. And this is what every candidate faces now when they run to be the nominee for their party, which is a very good thing. It's really good for every single person who's running to be the most powerful person in the world to face a lot of heat and a lot of questioning about how they're going to stand up for Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedom. And every US politician should face heat on that issue. So, I want to say that my biggest hopes lie with the movements who were exerting this pressure. And I think we saw that really clearly. One thing that stood out to me also is that, largely thanks to Bernie Sanders, we did see more criticisms of Israel go mainstream. We really saw this starting in 2016 when Sanders skipped the AIPAC conference and gave his own speech instead, making such controversial statements as Palestinians deserve human rights. I want to be clear that this is a very, very low bar, and what he said should be considered the bare minimum and should not be considered radical at all. Nonetheless, it was a huge break with the status quo, unfortunately. That's a very sad commentary on where the status quo is. So by the time 2020 came around, it was unfashionable to agree to speak at AIPAC. I'm sure folks remember that Pete Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Warren, and of course Sanders agreed to skip AIPAC. Biden did not. Unfortunately, Klobuchar and Buttigieg both later said that they would give video addresses to the AIPAC conference instead of physically being there. So they got the headline saying that they would skip, but then they still gave an address to the conference. But nonetheless, any boycott of AIPAC going mainstream is a really, really good thing. AIPAC is a far-right organization that has supported a host of horrific acts from, U.S. support on Israel's 2014 war on Gaza to support for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So I think that any boycott of them going mainstream is a good thing. You just have to hold people to actually honoring the boycott that they say they're going to carry out. So I think that there's one thing that you have to be very careful about during a presidential election season, which is that rhetoric means far less than material record, yet campaign season is a time for showcasing rhetoric. But it's far more important to look at what candidates have actually done. For example, when Warren was asked by If Not Now if she would end the occupation, if she would end Israel's occupation, she said yes. But if you look at her record on Palestine, it has serious problems and it's not as strong as Sanders, who's also isn't perfect. So instead of sort of walking away victorious and saying like, oh, great, we got this concession, I think it's important to press and demand really concrete commitments. And number one in our minds should be, what relief are you materially bringing? What are the material consequences, not just rhetoric? Because, opposing the occupation is not a very meaningful term. There have been a lot of people who have claimed to oppose the occupation. Obama, for example, who in fact did not do right by Palestinians. So what does it matter when Warren says this? And then, and how are folks mobilizing to carefully watch what actually happens on the ground? We saw another example in the case of Buttigieg, who in 2018 went on a delegation to Israel with the American Jewish Committee, and he came back saying pretty over-the-top pro-Israel things, for example, declaring that the US should model its national security on Israel's. But then during the debates and in some of his foreign policy speeches just a year to a year and a half later, he would occasionally say things that sounded a little better, for example, mentioning that Israel has to respect human rights and even suggesting at times that we should condition aid to Israel only to walk that back with vague language at a later date. So how excited should we be about Buttigieg saying those things? Do we really think that he's had a genuine change of heart within the span of a year and a half with no accounting for sort of why he took his former position? And then just one last thing I want to say is that Biden really held down the right pole of this debate throughout the primary. He repeatedly said he doesn't want to condition aid to Israel. He said somewhat recently that his administration would firmly reject the BDS movement. There are a lot of, Sanders himself says he doesn't support BDS. But to say that you're going to firmly reject the BDS movement, that is scary phrasing and opens the door to potential support for anti-BDS legislation, which is, eroding civil liberties across the US and being used to target Palestinian critics of Israel. Biden's position stems from a long career, as I said before. In 1995, he co-sponsored an act to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and he set aside funds to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that's an area where he has some overlap with Trump. And Biden backed Israel's targeted killings in the early 2000s, as well as its 2006 assault on Lebanon. So we just have to be really sober and real about the fact that Biden does occupy or has occupied the right pole of this debate during the primary.
Right. And Branko, just piggybacking off of what Sarah just said, Biden recently come out in opposition to annexation, but also, says that he's not prepared to condition aid. I think he's referred to conditioning aid as outrageous and crazy. Same thing with the embassy. He says he wouldn't move it, but he also says now he won't move it back. She describes some recent examples of Biden's pro-Israel record, but in your book, you really document that this goes back decades. Can you tell us about where this begins with Biden and what his track record was dating back to the 70s, really?
Yeah, for sure. It's a very long history, and I guess it begins in his 1972 campaign for Senate. That was the one that he famously won. It was a big upset. And there was this report at the time from one of the local Delaware newspapers that basically this grad student who had worked for the Biden campaign, who had been hired to write policy position papers, had quit the campaign, and he went to a newspaper and he complained that essentially Biden had said outright that he was going to take a hawkish stance on Israel, but he didn't really believe it. He was purely doing it for basically the political capital. And the student actually alleged that Biden had said, whatever stance I take on Israel right now is the position I will take for the rest of my career. And he further alleged that Biden had said, when you write this policy position paper in the Middle East, you can't include my real views because my real views would be political suicide. And those views included, having Israel give back the land that it conquered, for example. And the Biden campaign kind of denied it, but not really. They said that this didn't happen, but actually it was just devil's advocate, and a lot of things were being discussed at the time. So it's not really fair to single this out as an actual position that Biden held. Whatever the case, ultimately, that really is what Biden did for the rest of his career. That pro-Israel position that he took in 1972 ended up being his lodestar for the entire 36 years and more that he was in power. For example, in the 80s, he supported, they actually wrote this legislation that would ensure that the amount of aid that Israel got from the US was always equivalent to the debt that it owed to the United States, which is at the time remarked upon as a pretty astounding piece of legislation. No other country ever got that kind of favorable treatment from the US. And it actually allowed Israel to get past this other legislation from 1975 that basically said that if you were a country that was, hadn't paid its debts to the US in a year, then you weren't qualified for US aid. And that basically sort of attempted to circumvent that and make sure that Israel was always going to keep getting money. He then supported an extremely favorable debt refinancing plan for Israel after that, with a very low interest rate. Again, favorable treatment, unlike like any other country. And actually, Alan Cranston, who had authored that previous piece of legislation about aid, and Alan Cranston was very pro-Israel. Alan Cranston even thought that went too far. Biden would do things like, for example, when Israeli forces massacred the refugees at Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, Biden ended up maybe, he sort of did some very tepid remarks about it. Then he kind of went to this retreat where he appeared with the executive director of AIPAC at the time, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu, who, by the way, is one of Biden's very good friends, very old friends. It's a thing that he liked to bring up a lot until Netanyahu sort of now achieved this reputation as this pretty terrible authoritarian. So now it's sort of not convenient to talk about his friendship with him. But and after this massacre, Biden said, well, the presence of Israel in Lebanon is vitally important. And this continued on and on. In 1998, he was one of the Democratic lawmakers who wrote a letter to Clinton to sort of ward him off from coming out with this intention to restart the peace process, to kind of push Netanyahu into restarting the peace process. And the Republicans sent a very angry, fiery letter to Clinton, demanding that he not do this. Biden and the others kind of played the good cop, and it worked, and Clinton dropped these plans. And as Sarah mentioned, he voted for the law that ultimately allowed Trump to move the embassy, which obviously Biden doesn't want to move back now. And he has said at the time to do anything less would simply deny Israel the kind of statehood that the status of statehood that every country deserves. He said things along the lines of the U.S. and Israel must stay together and must always be united, because the Arabs simply will not negotiate unless they see that the U.S. and Israel are completely simpatico. And Biden was very richly rewarded for this. When he ran in 1987, he outraised everyone very quickly. I think within a couple of weeks, he kind of raised nearly $2 million or something along those lines. Doesn't sound like much now, but at the time it was a lot of money. And he did this because his fundraising team came out of the world of Israel, pro-Israeli lobbying. And he's very much kept those ties since then. I mean, he at one point was one of the leading recipients of basically things like speaking fees and that kind of thing from pro-Israel, donors and lobbies and that kind of thing. And it sort of culminated with him becoming vice president. At the time, Chuck Schumer said, well, Biden is the biggest friend to Israel in this administration. And of course, Biden had spent the preceding decades really sucking up to the Israeli government, particularly those kind of more reactionary forces in the Israeli government, in the Israeli political scene. And you would think that these decades of loyalty would have yielded some sort of progress or some ability to negotiate. But of course, Biden and Obama were kind of constantly humiliated by Netanyahu, who just simply, he'll be taking their aid and saying, well, screw you, we're going to do whatever we want. In one case, he actually announced the spate of illegal settlements as Biden was visiting the country. And of course, famously, we talk a lot about Russian interference in 2016 and all this kind of thing. For some reason, it's completely accepted that Israel has been interfering in US politics for many years in outrageous ways, not just to influence policy, but also to swing elections. We remember the way that Netanyahu disrespected Obama by doing that very provocative speech in Congress against the Iran deal. People also may not remember, but back in 2012, there was a big to-do over the fact that Netanyahu was very clearly putting his thumb on the scale for Mitt Romney, another old friend of Benjamin Netanyahu's, and that he was at the time, what was considered a very outrageous piece of meddling in another country's domestic affairs. I believe there were even ads that were run at the time that sort of suggested that Netanyahu was going to lean towards the Republicans. All of Biden's kind of slavish devotion to just pushing pro-Israel policy no matter what, to basically letting them off the hook for anything they do, even if it's directly a piece of disrespect against U.S. policy, it didn't really move the needle in any way. Biden continued to be walked all over by Netanyahu and Biden's administration. And, I guess we'll see what happens if he wins, but I suspect the result probably will not be that much different if Biden's already compromising on so many things and sort of going out of his way to show that he is incredibly devoted to Israel. I don't see, that changing when he becomes president.
Right. I wanted to turn to Iran for a moment. These brutal sanctions of the Trump administration have obviously made the Iran's COVID crisis even worse. Sarah, I know you've written about this issue. There's been a whole bunch of human rights organizations, and I've actually even been surprised at some of the Dem lawmakers who have come out and condemned the sanctions and even called for them to be suspended, if not ended. Sarah, you wrote a piece for In These Times specifically about Biden's reaction to this and how it was insufficient. Can you explain that piece?
Yeah, so ending President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran should be very low-hanging fruit for Joe Biden, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, where we have evidence that US sanctions are increasing deaths from the virus. So the reason it should be low-hanging fruit is because the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, was lauded as a cornerstone of the Obama-Biden administration. And it gave sanctions relief in exchange for constraints on Iran's civil nuclear enrichment. So Biden has repeatedly lauded the Obama-Biden administration's role in striking this deal when discussing his credentials to be president. Yet Biden has fallen well short of calling for lifting US sanctions, which are stipulated under the deal, even if just temporarily for the pandemic. He's not even calling for, lifting sanctions for 180 days or anything like that. So Biden waited until April 2nd to break his silence on the issue of US sanctions. He released a statement that opened with a lot of lofty language about how in times of crisis, America should lead. We should be the first to offer help to people who are hurting or in danger. And then it went on to criticize Trump's maximum pressure strategy, saying whatever our differences with the Iranian people, or whatever our differences with the Iranian government, rather, we should support the Iranian people. Yet nowhere in the statement does Biden actually call for an end to sanctions. Again, a demand that should be very easy for someone who lauded the Iran nuclear deal so frequently on the campaign trail. Instead, Biden's primary demands have been focused on clearer guidelines for humanitarian exemptions and streamlining channels for banking and public health, which is really Washington speak for change nothing. This idea of a nicer sanctions regime is really PR cover for continuing the status quo of starving and mass punishment of Iranians. There are already so-called humanitarian exemptions on the books, but the problem is that they don't work because of inherent problems of how complex they are, because of the fact that companies get spooked and won't do business, but also perhaps most importantly, because the Trump administration launches belligerent threats all the time saying, if we catch you violating Iran sanctions, you're in big trouble. So despite the humanitarian exemptions on the books, aid is not getting through, and the economy is tanking, and ordinary people are hurting. And we've been hearing from doctors and from regular people in Iran that there's a shortage of things like ventilators amid the COVID-19 crisis as a direct result of US sanctions. So, you know, the problem is that this idea that you're not calling for a lifting of sanctions, but instead better channels and clearer humanitarian exemptions is unfortunately emerging as a line among some in the Democratic Party beyond Biden. It's a way to sort of avoid offending the national security consensus. And it strikes a strong contrast with a letter that was released. You know, it was led by Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and it was signed by, I think, 34 members of Congress that had a clearer demand for a lifting of sanctions and also named economic sanctions, naming the fact that it's, you know, you should not cut off ventilators. You also should not deliberately destroy the economy of a country, especially during a global pandemic. So I just want to point out that there are other signs that Biden is presently to the right of the Obama-Biden administration. So the other day I was looking on his campaign website, and I saw that his official line on his website is that he wants to strengthen and extend the nuclear deal, while, quote, more effectively pushing back against Iran's other destabilizing activities. This is very disturbing. It read to me as code for saying that he wouldn't return to the Iran deal that was as it was negotiated under the Obama administration. And it reflects the word choice of entities like, you know, the far right FDD, but also Center for American Progress, where there's all this signaling that you're going to be tougher and make the Iran deal better. And it's all code for saying I won't return to it as it was negotiated. You know, I think I want to be clear that, you know, the Iran nuclear deal itself was kind of an extortion racket. It's premised on the idea that the US should be the only nuclear weapons power. I mean, you know, US agencies, intelligence agencies acknowledged at the time that Iran didn't have a nuclear weapons program, but nonetheless, it's premised in the idea that only the US should be a nuclear power. But nonetheless, I think that we have to look at the forces that oppose the Iran nuclear deal and acknowledge that they are very scary, pro-war forces, some of the worst forces in our time. And so I think we have to look at opposition to the Iran deal from the right as a really destructive force. And, you know, so just one reflection I have on Biden's present position on Iran is that unfortunately, we're seeing that Trump has pulled everything so far to the right that we really barely even notice that Biden is to the right of the Obama-Biden administration on Iran. So, you know, I want to be clear, none of this is to give Trump a pass. I mean, Trump has been horrific on Iran. His maximum pressure campaign is extremely brutal. You know, his terrifying brinksmanship, almost bringing the US to direct overt war with Iran. But what we're seeing is that things have been pushed so far to the right that it's barely made a blip in the public discourse that Biden now appears to be to the right of the Biden-Obama administration.
Branko, do you have anything to add to that? My next question was is kind of connected to what Sarah was just speaking about, but I think most people from the outside looking in might think that it's one of the only foreign policy issues where there might be some daylight, sizable daylight between Trump and Biden. Obviously, the flagship foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration is viewed, which Trump violated. Is there anything about Biden's involvement in that that you think is notable? And if he were to beat Trump, do you foresee much of a change in terms of Iranian policy? I mean, Sarah just said, I mean, the Trump administration's policies towards Iran have been so belligerent that it's kind of hard to be worse. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
I mean, I would suspect that probably they would, that if he became president, he would move towards ending some of what Trump's done. But I mean, obviously the language that Sarah points out is pretty concerning. So it's hard to know. I mean, I don't see what the upshot of it would be for Biden to, you know, continue sort of antagonizing Iran, particularly given, as we talked about, you know, protecting Obama's legacy. That's very, not just important to Biden, but obviously important to Obama as well. We had a pretty large role in securing Biden's nomination. And it's also important to a lot of kind of establishment Democrats as well. So I think, you know, what shape it'll take, who knows? But I think he probably will move to a less belligerent kind of position against Iran. I mean, one thing I do want to note, though, is along with this Iran stuff that we've just talked about, as well as the, you know, his promise not to move the embassy out of Jerusalem, you know, because he says, well, it's there now, so we got to keep it there. This is how politics has worked in the United States for decades. Actually, it's a lot of how politics works or has worked in a lot of kind of Western capitalist democracies for the past few decades, since the neoliberal turn in the 80s, where basically you have this very ideologically committed and powerful and very strategically clever right wing that essentially it lays out the agenda. It says what's going to happen. It constantly pushes the envelope further and further right. And then when you have against it this sort of middling kind of liberal order that is kind of afraid of its own shadow, sort of has accepted the right wing's terms of debate on nearly everything, and is kind of just assumes that a constant rightward drift is just the natural way of things, and that you can only fight against it so much. This is what you end up with, which is the far right pushes things into a far right direction. Liberals say, well, we'll scale back some of that stuff, some of the worst stuff, but we will keep this. We don't want to push too many buttons, so we'll keep this element. And so this is, you know, when people talk about incrementalism in the United States, I mean, there is incrementalism in terms of change, but it tends to be on the right. It's you look at things like whether it's economic policy or particularly foreign policy, things just get further and further right. And every liberal leader comes in, unlike Trump, who has kind of made it his mission to really go out of his way and very pettily try and undo everything that Obama did. I think mostly out of just sort of very vindictive kind of revenge, rather than any overarching ideology to him. You know, instead of that, liberals just say, well, we'll take most of this, or we'll take some of this, and then, you know, the right, next time it comes into power, pushes things even further, and this is how you get this slow drift. And as Sarah says, I mean, you know, Trump is right now so monopolized the psyches of Democratic voters and Democrats themselves that it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that Biden and probably his administration will actually end up being pretty conservative, far more conservative than the Obama administration. I mean, of course, this is all contingent on who they pick to staff the administration, but I suspect that, you know, it will probably be along the same lines of the same people who were in the Obama administration, who were lining up for the Clinton administration, and if so, you probably won't get too much pushback against all the things that Trump has done.
Exactly what you just said about the Obama administration. I just have a quick question for both of you. Is there anything, Sarah kind of already mentioned Iran in potentially running to the right of Obama on that issue, but is there anything notable? I mean, you know, the Obama administration kind of defined by counterinsurgency, expansion of the war on terror into Africa, and drone program, obviously, intervention in Libya. Is there anything notable either of you think that distinguishes Biden in either direction compared to the Obama administration, or do you guys think that it would just be mainly what we saw 4 years ago continued?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the stuff that he said about Iran that I just named, that to me is a really big distinction. So far since becoming the presumptive nominee, the most public foreign policy positions that Biden has taken are criticizing Trump for not being tough enough on China and saying that he would firmly oppose BDS. And those are two positions that are really aimed at depicting himself as tough and confrontational. And I want to be clear, I said this before, but I want to reiterate that, Trump is a warmonger who he has done horrific things. He escalated the war in Yemen. He has been more belligerent and racist on China, horrific to Iran. So the list is very long. But we do need to be sober and clear-eyed about the fact that Biden was on the right of the Democratic field when it comes to foreign policy during this primary. And so that is true. And it's also true that he has sought to define himself and to distinguish himself according to his foreign policy record. So those two things should just raise some concerns. I am concerned that his administration would be to the right of the Obama administration. I also just have a lot of questions. For example, would Biden end the war on Yemen without tremendous pressure from peace and anti-war groups? I'm not so sure. I hope that he would re-enter the Iran deal. I think that's the best possible course for now, given where we're at. Would he re-enter it as it was negotiated by Obama without tremendous pressure from the left? I'm honestly not so sure about that either. I think that those are just questions we need to be asking ourselves. This is all to say that I think now is a very important time to have robust and dedicated movements against unjust US wars and meddling and occupation and proxy battle that are paying very, very close attention to what is happening. And I think that this is truly a matter of solidarity with the 96% of the world that doesn't get to vote in US elections, but is certainly impacted by US actions. The US has 800 military bases around the world. It's the biggest military empire that's ever existed. People all over the world are impacted by what the US does. And so I think we need to keep a very close eye.
I wanted to ask Branko you the same question. You studied, obviously, Biden's political record quite extensively. Connected to that Obama question, I was just wondering, did anything stand out in terms of disagreements during that 8 years between the two of them that you think could signal a potential difference in foreign policy?
Sarah mentioned his opposition to the Libyan war. There's also, Biden was against the surge in Afghanistan when the Obama administration began. He also reportedly was against the assassination of Osama bin Laden, thought it was too risky. So, those are a couple of differences, but I think it's also important to note that Biden was reportedly the architect of the what's called the Counterterrorism Plus strategy that Obama, that really defined Obama's presidency. And that's basically, let's move away from putting boots on the ground and embarking on foolish invasions and other things along those lines, regime change wars. Instead, what we'll do is, instead of these cumbersome, often chaotic wars and troop deployments, we'll just sort of bomb a bunch of countries remotely, and we will send people under the cover of night to go in and assassinate militants, or people we hope are militants. Perhaps they're just sort of Arab men between the ages of 18 and 40 or something along those lines. That was apparently Biden's push, by all reports, and I don't think that that's going to change. I mean, that's become Trump's approach as well. He's obviously ratcheted up the carnage and the scale of these operations. I don't expect Biden to push back against it. Obama was an incredibly charismatic, very popular leader with an actual grassroots movement behind him and a really across-the-board party mandate. Biden doesn't have any of those things. He's obviously sort of lost a few steps in terms of just his ability to communicate and personally relate to people since 2016. He doesn't have a movement. He's sort of explicitly rejecting the idea of having a movement, and he's very clearly thumbing his nose at the progressive wing of the party. So I don't see any incentive or even if he had the inclination to do it, I don't even see the ability for him to kind of push back against that kind of military policy that's so ingrained and was ingrained by Obama. Beyond that, beyond just the Middle East, Biden was also responsible in many ways for this explosion in migration that happened under Obama, that Obama dealt with by family separation. I know that may shock some people, but Obama separated families. Didn't do it in quite the same, obviously cruel way as Trump did, but he did separate families. And actually, he did on occasion. They did actually also separate families at the border. Obama also put kids in cages when there was a wave of child migrants in, was it 2013? And they ended up getting put in these disgusting, awful camps. Biden was the one who was sort of saying he was going to South America and he was saying, you guys need to crack down on these people. And then also he was saying, if you're going to come here, just know you're not going to be welcomed with open arms. It's going to be pretty tough for you. And part of that surge, part of the reason behind it was this Plan Colombia that Biden was responsible for under Clinton, which essentially funneled millions of dollars to what were basically death squads in a host of Central and South American countries that ended up, creating the very violence that people ended up fleeing, and also pushed these kind of neoliberal economic policies in the regions that made life a lot harder for people, and again pushed them to seek economic fortune elsewhere. And Biden, he thinks that was a great plan. He, under Obama, one of the final things that Biden was responsible for was this, a similar plan that was labeled at the time Biden's Billion. And he actually wrote an op-ed in 2019, I believe, basically saying, this is going to be my policy as president towards Central and South America. Is I'm going to, these programs that I pushed under Obama and then under Clinton before that, they worked, and I'm basically going to do the exact same thing. So, we can all look forward to much more desperate migrants, looking for relief from violence and poverty, showing up at the doorstep of the US. We can look forward to a Biden administration probably treating those migrants incredibly cruelly, and probably being pushed by the far right. And just as that migrant crisis helped fuel the rise of Trump, it remains to be seen how fueling this kind of thing, particularly in conjunction with what we're going to see as climate change starts to really heat up, how that's going to feed into the growth of the far right. I hope not, but realistically, when I look at the situation, I can't lie to myself, or I can't lie to you guys here. One thing I do want to stress. As Sarah said, Trump is obviously much worse than all these things. It doesn't really bear repeating. I would assume that doesn't really even have to be said. But there's an attitude among people where they say, well, maybe not so much people watching this, but people that they may know who say, well, sure, you're not going to get everything, but at the very least, you're going to get rid of Trump. You're going to get rid of all these terrible things that Trump has done and kind of reset things to how they were, back to normal. Normal was not normal for many people. It was quite terrible. The Obama administration did many terrible things, not just to migrants and to people in the Middle East, but to people within the United States as well. And, again, people listening to this don't have to be told this, but I think this is an important message to tell to people who don't see things the way that maybe we do here, or aren't exposed to these perspectives, which is, I think it's perfectly defensible to vote for Biden, to stop a worse Trump disaster, absolutely. But if people are going to do that, they also have to be ready to resist Biden in the same way that they have sort of tried to resist Trump in his 4 years, because Biden will do a lot of terrible things if the only pressure that he is getting First of all, the only pressure he's getting is none. He'll still do some bad things because that's just sort of the inertia of US foreign policy. But most likely the pressure that he will face is from the far right, people like these lockdown protesters. And Biden, if you look at his history, if you read my book, he has not tended to fare very well when it comes to pressure from the right. He tends to buckle to it. And so people, Democratic voters, all these people who vote for him as a sort of stopgap against Trump, that makes complete sense. But people have to be ready to pressure Biden and to resist the terrible things he does, the same ferocity that they have for the last 4 years.
Dave has been collecting questions before I get to my last question. I think he had some audience questions that people have been asking while you've both been talking. Dave, do you have those?
Yeah, this has been a great conversation, folks. Thank you. Thank you so much. And honestly, I think you've answered some of those, particularly Branko, what you just said. There have been a lot of questions about, does criticizing Biden, is that implicitly helping Trump, and what do we do about it? There have been some questions about beyond Biden inside the Democratic Party. Eugenia asked, do you see any way forward to unite progressives in another movement outside the Democratic Party that responds to your values? People were asking, let's see, another one here. What are the prospects of a one-state equal rights movement inside the Democratic Party? And is there any indication that Joe Biden would adopt that position under pressure?
I can speak to the first question. Just the question of, is there any way forward for progressive unity on this issue? So I think that we are living in a time right now where there is incredible momentum behind domestic demands for economic justice and broad left programs that can address how people are immediately hurting right now with the COVID-19 crisis. Things like Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, paying people to stay home, all, bold, broad left programs for helping people survive this crisis, and also making sure we don't revert back to what was normal before, because as Branko pointed out, normal also wasn't okay. And I think it's going to be a really critical time that we peg concepts of global justice and internationalism to those domestic demands to ensure that no domestic gains are built on the backs of anyone else, and to ensure that we are also encouraging the US to remove its boot from the neck of people around the world. For example, what would it look like to build a Medicare for all movement here in the US that also acknowledges that 5 years of US and Saudi and UAE war on Yemen have decimated the country's medical system, now paving the way for a horrific COVID-19 outbreak? What are the opportunities that we have to show that the domestic demands that we have must be accompanied by demands for justice for peoples who are oppressed by US wars and occupation? And I think that that is going to be a really important thing moving forward. And something, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there's opportunity to build more of an anti-war sentiment into the sort of left resurgence that we're seeing today.
I guess I'll take the second question. It was the one state movement. What's the prospects for it? I mean, under Biden, I don't expect that there would be that much progress. But the key thing is it's not necessarily because of public opinion. I mean, I honestly think most of the this kind of democratic kowtowing to this very hard right line on Israel and Palestine, I think is mostly to do with money and campaign finance. Not exclusively, but I think that's a big part of it. I doubt that Biden's going to go against his donors. There's an argument that he's got. If he only has one term, he'll maybe be a little bit bold. I'm not sure about that. I guess could happen. But I think there is possibility to build a pressure movement that really builds on that momentum that Sarah mentioned. I mean, at the moment, Israel's actions are so outrageous, so over the top, awful and cruel. I mean, I just saw today Netanyahu saying that Palestinians who happen to be annexed, they won't have Israeli citizenship. I mean, people have talked about an apartheid state for a long time, and now, I mean, Israel is really becoming much closer to what we tend to think of as a traditional apartheid state. Well, actually, much worse. I mean, African Americans in the U.S. lived in apartheid, but they actually had citizenship. And I think that's the irony, is that the right in Israel, which of course is supported by the right in the United States, is going so far off the deep end that they might end up actually being their own worst enemy, because it will build up, at least I hope it will build up, popular outrage that goes beyond just the kind of the young people. There's a generation gap, but we'll actually start to, for even older people, they'll start to go, hey, hold on, what are we doing? Why are we just, especially at a time of crisis, just sending this government, untold amounts of money, even as they just become more and more kind of provocative. One thing I want to mention, I didn't mention in the rest of the talk. We talked about the anti-BDS law, or potentially an anti-BDS law. That's a good example of a case where a President Biden, should he happen, would need to be resisted. Because what does Biden always talk about? He always talks about how he can work with Republicans in certain things, that bipartisanship isn't dead, so on and so forth. And that is one area where there's total overlap between Democrats and Republicans. Incredibly illiberal overlap, but overlap nonetheless. And it's definitely one that is likely, I think, one of the more likely ones to sort of be pursued by President Biden, and to sort of reach across the aisle to pass. So yeah, people. It'll be important to build a movement, push for what looks increasingly like a one-state solution. Probably the only viable option increasingly. But also at the same time, people have to just fight back against these kind of constant assaults that will probably be happening throughout any 4 years that Biden serves.
I just want to add one thing. I don't want my outlook to be overly rosy, but I do want to say that the fact that Biden felt the need to come out and say that he firmly opposes BDS is one way to measure the growing power of the BDS movement. I think that it's scary, the many repressive measures, the targeting of BDS is scary. It's not a good thing. I don't want in any way to say it's a good thing, but it is one way of showing that it's having an impact. The movement is growing and it's perceived as a threat to the Israeli occupation and the current state of affairs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Both of you mentioned a few people in some of your remarks, but can either of you speak to more about some of the specific people that surround Biden who we might expect to show up in positions of influence? Certainly, Branko, you mentioned just a few moments ago that you probably expect more of the Obama and Clinton era holdovers, but are there specific people that that he's listening to in his campaign that we should that maybe people don't know about that we should learn about?
I'm not sure about on his campaign. I mean, there's definitely people who have right-wing foreign policy views on there, but one name was floated, I believe, for Secretary of State, and I think actually it's pretty likely to be the pick, is Michelle Flournoy, who she was going to be Clinton's Secretary of State when she was measuring the drapes. Obviously, that didn't happen, but now it's round two. This is the next shot. So there was an Axios report that kind of went through a few names that were being bandied about by the Biden campaign, and she ended up on there. And she was part of this think tank called the Center for a New American Security, which is basically, it's sort of like the Center for American Progress, but for foreign policy. It was set up by Podesta, a lot of Clinton ties, and Flournoy, she's a liberal hawk, so isn't necessarily going to push for the same sort of like outrageously, cruel, destructive policies that the right wing pushes for, but nonetheless, would support something like the intervention in Libya, intervention in Syria. In fact, actually, one of the things she had helped write this position paper that sort of was viewed in 2016 as a potential blueprint for the Clinton administration, or what was thought to be the Clinton administration at the time. And among the ideas was, send arms to Ukraine. So that's been done. Trump's done that. But that's obviously a very serious stepping up of tensions in that area, and may well be something that Biden, especially with Flournoy there, may end up pursuing. I mean, Biden actually was responsible for the expansion of NATO in the 90s that really kind of fueled the rise of Putin and the rise of kind of anti-American Russian nationalism that ironically has come back to bite the Democrats. But beyond that, Flournoy also talked about the need to aggressively pursue the kind of all of the above climate strategy that Obama had carried on with for a while. And she sort of saw this as a matter of national security. How that's going to line up with any plans by Sanders and his allies to push Biden on climate change remains to be seen. I mean, we also don't know yet if Flournoy will end up. I think the other notable thing to point out is that we talked about how much leeway does Biden have to push on foreign policy, or how much leeway is it to push on foreign policy, and it's notable that foreign policy was one of the big subjects that was left off the policy task forces that Sanders is doing with Biden, as a way to kind of push him left, and as a way to kind of have some of the overlaps between the campaigns settled for when the platform is drafted. So that suggests that there may not be really all that much pushback from within the Democratic Party, even members of the left of the Democratic Party. If Biden ends up winning, it may have to be something that really is driven from the grassroots up. Grim stuff there, but it's important to have that in mind.
Yeah, that caught my attention as well. There was a lot of celebration of the Sanders task force, and foreign policy was totally left off. And I remember about 3 weeks or a month ago, there were a lot of headlines saying, there are signs that Biden might take cues from Sanders on foreign policy, but then there's been no follow-up to that. And we really have to have follow-up, and we have to be paying very close attention, because it's very easy to use nice sounding rhetoric and make promises, but the question is what's materially going to happen. I think we've seen Biden use a lot of rhetoric around, I'm going to end endless wars. That's what all Democrats are saying now, but he's not acknowledging his role in creating those wars, and he's not making specific commitments that will actually end endless wars. I just wanted to speak to one thing that I've been sort of paying close attention to. Biden has actually really not shared a lot of information at all about who he would plan to surround himself foreign policy-wise. Recently, a broad coalition of anti-war groups sent him a letter with a series of demands. I did not see any public response from him at all. It seems like that's the kind of thing that someone in his position should feel pressure to publicly respond to. I've also been paying attention to a sort of think tank organization called National Security Action. It exists. It was comprised and created by former Obama aides, people like Ben Rhodes. And if you just look at the press statements that they're putting out really regularly, they're really mirroring a lot of the rhetoric that Biden has been using, especially the anti-China stuff, the stuff, hitting Trump from the right on China. So when I look at the stuff that they're putting out, I get the impression that they are auditioning for a potential Biden administration. And so, it's really, also people like Samantha Power, who has been very vocally supportive of Biden. In particular, Ben Rhodes and Samantha Power have a lot of personal culpability in U.S. participation in the war on Yemen. And while they've both come out against it, there has not been a full accounting of their roles and sort of a true coming clean. And so, and then, we're seeing them, we're seeing people like Ben Rhodes embrace some of the more right-wing Biden rhetoric that's coming out. So I just think that we should be very careful and, just watch all of this very closely and not let him, make him feel the pressure, force him to respond to the demands of anti-war organizations, force him to answer why, if he picks someone like Ben Rhodes in his administration, how dare he have someone who had such a direct role in the U.S. Participation in the war on Yemen.
That's great. David Mandel, who's an activist in California, who's worked on pushing the resolutions on Palestine through there, it says that the Democratic grassroots is way more progressive than the corporatists on international affairs too. It could be fertile ground for pushing state parties on platforms and resolutions. Curious about your thoughts on how Joe Biden would relate to state parties, and progressive organizing there. Famously, Barack Obama has been criticized for allowing the state parties to really wither during the years that he was the head of the party.
I can start with this one. I mean, honestly, it's not a subject I've thought much about, but I think there's something really important to it, which is that the Sanders campaign was kind of an attempt by the left to kind of engineer a grassroots movement, but from the top down. And, it was relatively successful, to some extent, but always there was going to be gaps, right? And there was going to be limits to how much it could actually really do. And so I think, when I think about electoral politics in the years ahead, I think, very unlikely, I'm not saying it's impossible, but very unlikely that there would be someone like Sanders, a kind of, a leftist with the kind of popular appeal and political skill that he's had over the decades to come in and run for president. I think the more likely avenue, and probably one that people, as the questioner points out, that people have to think about is looking at changing things at a more local level and, changing the composition of Congress. Ultimately, the foreign policy is as Sarah mentioned, the area that the president has far more latitude to do what he or she wants, but also it tends to be constrained by what Congress does. It made a lot of sense to pour all this energy and attention into the Sanders campaign because it really was a once in a lifetime opportunity. Hopefully it won't be, but it's certainly the way we're looking at now. But if it's finished now, I think looking to support people at whether it's running for state level or people running for Congress with the House seats or Senate seats, people who have progressive positions, not just on domestic policy, but also on foreign policy, because ultimately, Biden is someone who, he is ideological, he is very conservative, but I think he's someone who, like many politicians, will go the way of the path of least resistance. And if there's pressure coming from not just activist groups who are outside the party, but also from people within the party, that potentially can sort of create a chain reaction, going up the chain and influencing the future direction of the party and what Biden does, or at least what a future Democratic president does. So yeah, I mean, I think people should be looking more local now. You know, I mean, take a page out of Sanders' book. I mean, the reason he got where he was because he built power at the local level of Burlington, and then he moved to the state level. And you know, obviously, as mayor, once he was in there. And once he was able to build up the kind of the popularity and the loyal following he did there, he was able to really push a heterodox foreign policy at that municipal level, which, you know, we might say, who cares? You know, it didn't change what Reagan was doing, but I think it was an important step. And, you know, if you can imagine people across the country doing similar things, you know, that could have a really big impact on you know, the way that the Democratic Party goes.
Yeah, I would say that I imagine that the person who asked that question has a lot of thoughts on this question of strategy, and I would love to hear your thoughts at some point. I think questions of strategy are really hard, and you know, I will say that I think that there are a lot of people who could feel the heat a little bit more. For example, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus who vote the wrong way on legislation, who hardly ever have to answer for how they vote on foreign policy legislation, who aren't even accustomed to being pressed on that. They sometimes really do respond if they get pressure, or at least they don't like it. And so making the cost to doing bad things higher is one thing that I think is very valuable. And, you know, just what you said about the base of the Democratic Party shifting, you know, like I said, polls show that's true, especially with people of color. We're seeing higher and higher levels of sympathy and solidarity with Palestinians in particular. So I definitely, my hope is that that shift and growing movements can help change the status quo.
Sorry I disappeared for a second. We're a little over an hour now. I think we're going to wrap up, but I just had one last question for both of you. I just wanted to end, I mean, we've been talking about all the issues with Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, and I think everybody who's watching this probably knows that Trump, as Branko noted earlier, but I wanted to maybe hopeful note, even though Bernie lost, we saw, and Sarah, you referenced this earlier, but we really saw a massive amount of enthusiasm, not just for his campaign, but more broadly, the issues he was highlighting. And, you know, we've notable progressive gains we've seen, you know, congressional members become more progressive. Now we have people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and state governments and city councils. Sarah, you're in Chicago, where I think 12 or 15% of the city council is now socialist. And, you know, if we look at exit polls, I live in Texas, and exit polls of Democratic voters, even though Biden won the state here, still suggests that it's Bernie's program that was much more popular, and that people probably voted for Biden because they were told that Bernie couldn't beat Trump. I think even socialism had like 60% of people said they supported it here, which is incredible. I'm just wondering if you, to both of you, if you believe that we might be seeing the beginning of something kind of deeper than Bernie, and deeper than just these issues. And regardless of whether Trump or Biden wins in November, do you believe there's something beginning to emerge that could potentially change U.S. politics in terms of foreign policy, but even beyond?
I wasn't sure if who was jumping in there, but yeah, definitely. I mean, to borrow the phrase that Sanders used in his debate with Biden, you know, it's really the Sanders wing that has won the ideological argument. I mean, I completely agree with you, Michael. The reason Biden won was because people were, particularly older voters, were incessantly bombarded with the idea that he was more electable, and they've also been terrified for 4 years by you know, MSNBC and CNN about Trump and how scary he is. And of course, he is scary, but you know, isn't that much of a gulf between, you know, business as usual. But yeah, people were scared and they thought, well, this guy will get us in. So, you know, Biden's program does not have a mandate. Biden was chosen as the vehicle by which to exercise the country from Trump, but that's it. And so, you know, I think you already see the testimony from people who worked on the Sanders campaign, who, you know, maybe weren't politically involved before, who, you know, got their first taste of political activism, political organizing, people who, in some cases, quit their lives, really, quit you know, university, quit the jobs to go and volunteer for the campaign. That committed activist base, coupled with the fact that even among, you know, voters that we might assume are more conservative, even they are coming around to some of the stuff that Sanders was saying, not just in domestic, but also in foreign policy. I think it's a shift that people should take advantage of. And I think it's only going to get, you know, go more and more in that direction. I mean, we have to remember that Trump won by running fraudulently, but nonetheless running on a kind of vaguely more anti-interventionist line than Clinton. Obviously, he promised to commit war crimes and all sorts of horrible things, but, you know, he also came out against the Iraq War and said that, you know, the U.S. shouldn't be going into different countries and all this kind of stuff. And he won the Republican primary. Everyone assumed the Republican base was this very, very pro-war segment of the population, and that's shown that it's not true. And there really isn't a taste for war, really, among the U.S. public, the voting public now. And I think that's only going to get become more true as, particularly with this crisis, you know, people don't want to have the money, their money, being squandered overseas for some, you know, God knows what, that has no real relevance to their lives. They want to see that money being used. So I think people, you know, those are the kinds of things that need to be built on in the years ahead. I think also one thing that needs to be well utilized is, you know, we've all talked about kind of how incoherent some of the resistance to Trump has been, where, you know, as soon as he came in, you know, Trump sort of cozying up with El-Sisi in Egypt, for example, was widely decried as this disgusting thing of, you know, Trump cozying up to a dictator and so on and so forth. And obviously that's true, but of course, you know, no one cared when Obama had done that. Obama and John Kerry had done that. But there is a real, you know, the Democratic Party has kind of boxed itself in, or potentially boxed itself in if it's taken advantage of, in the sense that they have, and it's not just Democrats, but also kind of the centrist establishment, they've really made this case for years that, you know, allying oneself with authoritarian governments and giving aid to human rights abusers is this un-American, very awful thing that has to be pushed back against. And I think, you know, that's the kind of rhetoric. Trump has obviously has sort of been the bane for the left in this election, in the sense that his existence has been used as a conservatizing vehicle for the party, for basically to have voters swallow a whole bunch of policy prescriptions and you know, ultimately a candidate that they necessarily weren't really that excited about or didn't even agree with. But Trump, whose you know, legacy and standing is going to exist far beyond you know, whether he leaves office or not, you know, that he can be used as a way to go, well, hold on, you know, we oppose Trump for this reason. Now you're doing this. You know, this is Trump-like, that kind of thing. You know, I think people should take advantage of that. And you know, obviously the Democratic Party is shameless, but the actual voters themselves, you know, I think genuinely do believe in this stuff, and that is an important weapon, I think, for persuading people. Or I hope it is.
Yeah, I think that we have to be hopeful while being sober about the challenges and sober about the present. You know, one thing that gives me hope is that the Sanders platform moved to the left on foreign policy in 2020 as compared to 2016, and made opposing unjust wars a greater focus of the campaign. And there seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm around that. And that's a really hopeful thing. I think that we can attribute that, at least in part, to his base and attribute it to movements against unjust US wars and, US support for the unjust actions of Israel. It does seem that the Sanders campaign largely avoided, not entirely, but largely avoided what Branko described, where you sort of attack Trump from the right, and by doing so are actually part of the rightward lurch. For example, Sanders was very supportive of the Korean peace process. The US is still party to that horrific war that's still ongoing. Broad left movements in South Korea desperately want it to end. And he sort of refused to buy into this rhetoric that a lot of his opponents in the field and a lot of Democrats overall have been embracing, this idea of like, Trump better go in and show he's tough on North Korea, which was actually really infuriating and upsetting to South Korean leftists who have long been calling for demilitarization and for an end to that war and have been supporting the peace process. So I think things like that are really hopeful. I think that the movements that sort of coalesce around Sanders, but also beyond that, just movements against unjust wars. Now is going to be a really important time for them to be mobilizing and for them to be building relationships with left movements that are moved by, what I mentioned before, these sort of broad universal domestic demands like Medicare for all and Green New Deal. US progressive movements have a certain amount of baggage in this department. For example, Lyndon B. Johnson, who's widely celebrated for his war on poverty, around the same time escalated the Vietnam War and even made claims that he was exporting the Great Society to Vietnam. And so, I think that what we saw in this last election is people rejecting the sort of US baggage of progressivism at home, but empire and domination abroad. And that I do think that we are seeing more of a shift of tying economic justice domestically to justice for people who are harmed by US occupation. And so I think it's going to be an important time to grow those relationships and grow those movements and be hopeful, but also very clear-eyed about the present and watch very closely what's happening on the ground materially to people who are in the crosshairs of US empire.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you again so much. This has been great, I think. And I'm going to throw it over to Dave to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We're going to wrap up now. Thanks. We want to thank all of you for joining us. Thanks to Branko Marcetic and Sarah Lazare for joining us today. Thanks also to In These Times Magazine and Verso Books for co-sponsoring the event. You can find Sarah's reporting at In These Times, and you can pick up Branko's excellent book on Joe Biden, Yesterday's Man, at the Verso Books website. For those new to us, Mondo Weiss is an independent nonprofit news and analysis publication from a left progressive perspective on the Israeli occupation and its impact on US politics. We're funded by readers, and if you found this program useful, please make a donation. It'll help us offer more programming like this in the future. You can donate securely online at our site, mondoweiss.net/donate. Everybody, please stay safe, wash your hands, and have a good day.